You're just trying to make a quick lunch, but bam, the ingredient prices are sky high. Don't panic. You're in the right place. I'll reveal how Americans in the 20th century whipped up delicious meals for less than $1. Yes, you heard right, $1. So the thing with a lot of American culture is that it takes away from immigrant cuisines and local regional ways of cooking that make the best use of what's already available around us. Stuff like soup beans and a lot of the dishes on this list are prime examples of that. And that's why they're so different from basic American cooking, which always typically revolves around meat and cheese, both of which, keep getting more expensive. I mean, what even is a soup, really? You put your beans in, you put the water in, mix, and voila, you're good to go. You've effectively made a solid meal for your family and kids in under $1, and the best part is you can do it again and again. Hey, if you know how to forage beans, you can essentially do it for free. It's one of the best ways to get protein on the market, and you can buy them in bulk for relatively cheap. They don't really need a lot of work in terms of flavor either, because anything more than basic seasonings will really bring out this soup's potential. Macaroni and tomatoes are the same, although macaroni can be kind of expensive these days. Back then, it was really affordable, and canned tomatoes were dirt cheap too. Putting them both together to make a lovely and simple tomato sauce-based dish cost next to nothing for families, and naturally, a lot of them had to adapt. If there's one thing this country loves more than convenience and easy work, it's saving money wherever possible, and often those two tend to conflict. Regional recipes like this, which are taken from African American communities, prove that those two goals don't really have to be at opposite ends of the spectrum, and you can definitely enjoy a cheap dinner that tastes good too. It was mostly heavily popular in the South and Midwest as a Depression-era dish that people were fond of, because it let them have comforting macaroni on a budget, plus it had a long shelf life. When the economy eventually started settling, people realized they didn't have to skimp out on it now, because back then, people were really going bare bones with just about everything they were eating. When they started to go the extra mile and still found this dish just as affordable, that was basically what solidified it as a staple of American eating for a long while to come. Again, we have red beans and rice, which show how budget-friendly nutrition really can be if you're willing to get down to it. Does it have the comfort level of a pizza? Not really, but is it good for your body and wallet and cuts down the time you spend in the kitchen severely? Definitely. Then why not? It's a fair bargain, and you can always reserve a day for ordering and pigging out. That's why dishes like these got as popular as they did. Not only were they easy and effective, but they were appropriate for the harsh times of the 20th century. We often look back at that time period and think, God, I wish I lived then, because everything seemed to have cost 10 times less than it does today. But it wasn't really that cut and dry. People were still scraping cents and $1 bills back then and were trying to have meals, ideally under $1 if they could help it. That's why so many ingredients you see on this list are really basic produce and fruits like tomatoes, as they are insanely easy to get for both rural and urban communities. In the city? No worries. Any superstore or fruit/vegetable retailer will get you set up for the rest of the week. In a rural community? Depending on where you live, you could be having gravies with anything, not just tomatoes. People even took to having squirrels, so imagination's definitely your friend when you're trying to spend less on each plate. Plus, some grits, biscuits, and rice would make tomato gravy even better. You were still getting all your protein needs met because of the red beans, which gym bros even today will swear by up and down and recommend you start adding to your diet immediately. Unfortunately for them, grandmas in the 20th century were way ahead of them, but somewhere along the line, it seems like we lost the memo. It's also usually grandmas who recommend we source our food locally. Who better to decide where we get our food from than the one who will end up cooking it? Plus, this next one might surprise you because in our day and age, it's everything but inexpensive. Salmon's really changed as a protein, both in terms of how and where we get it from and the prices we can expect. But a lot of dishes based off of it, like salmon cake patties, used to be so incredibly popular and loved, especially after canned fish started rolling around and made it even more expensive. To give you an estimate, or at least some kind of understanding of the times, Fishing and using the catches of the day in your everyday eating was so common back then that crab was considered poor man's food. So just think how often they were getting buckets of salmon. You just know it was a good day when your husband would bring one back. Plus, these ones wouldn't be packaged or processed. They were straight from the river. It's a bit sad that hobbies like fishing and foraging have gone out of style because they really can be defined as America's roots. We used to gather berries, make mushroom pot pies, and use bell peppers instead of Nashville hot sauce, you know? There's nothing wrong with any of that. I mean, as I sit here and tell you, I honestly finished a Nashville sandwich myself yesterday, but there's always more variety when food tastes in the country don't swing too violently towards one or the other. I think a lot of us can agree that while we wouldn't like to lose the convenience and comfort of having our favorite food and burgers on speed dial, thanks to Uber Eats and DoorDashing, we would still like to engage more with nature and just source our food locally sometimes and see what we can make of it. It's also a lot more reliable, because back then, you weren't afraid of all the additives and whatever else they were putting in your food. You knew it was just completely organic. Natural ingredients like cabbages, for example, were used in really creative ways, like baked cabbage and potato buns, especially because these were widely considered to be the cheapest possible vegetables you could buy in the 20th century. I mean, if you wanted to make a meal that would leave your entire family full, satisfied, and healthier afterwards, you'd definitely resort to things like this. Do you see how easy cooking can be? A lot of the TikTok trends I see these days have these really healthy, do-it-yourself recipes and meal plans that cost like half your paycheck. But how were these people doing it? Even if things have changed a lot, it wasn't 1,000 years ago. It was barely 70 to 80. Most of these recipes are still in your family cookbooks. I think the biggest change was definitely the downfall of farming as a concept and the gradual shift towards the fast food business model. I get that not every family liked to eat farm food, so they would often go for more foreign dishes, but even those didn't have to be as expensive as they are now. People were still eating Italian gnudi with brown butter sauce for under $1. So if we have any economists or cultural analysts watching, please share your thoughts in the comments below as to why we can't eat this way anymore. I'd love to read it anyway. Back to the gnudi. This was a pretty affordable dumpling that didn't really take any meat, and brown butter was still ridiculously cheap. All you needed besides the dumpling was just the butter and seasoning. So it figures why, in a time where pasta was usually cheap, this dish did as well as it did. We really do need to do something about pasta being taken away from us slowly and slowly. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but seriously, an Alfredo or pasta carbonara today does not cost the same at all. I mean, even if you account for annual price rises and inflation, this is still just crazy. We're talking about essentially the same dish going from costing under $1 to costing over $23. And in this whole time, the minimum wage hasn't really had the same rate of improvement. It's no wonder we can't get the same things anymore. You'd think at least bacon would be free from all of it. And then probably get happy because this dish uses its fair share of tiny little bacon chunks. But even that costs ridiculously more than it used to. Pasta carbonara, back when it was really easy for everyone to afford and make, was a bonding point for a lot of American citizens and Italian Americans as they introduced them to their culture and popularized the dish more and more. It especially went wild in homes after World War II, when there was a big emphasis on carbs and fiber to keep you full for longer. The war goes back to what I was talking about earlier, about how despite the way prices in these times seemed almost fantasy-like, people still had their fair share of economic woes that were dragging both their spirit and their wallet down. That's why they resorted to stews and broths and things like vegetable soup with parsley gremolata. I mean, just from the sound of that, you can already probably tell it's dirt cheap and super good for you. It uses low-cost vegetables that are worth just a few cents, and gremolata, which is just chopped parsley, garlic, and lemon zest, and mixes them into a hearty stew that takes full advantage of the flavors of the green and the light seasonings. You end up getting something that's cost-effective and something that even the kids can enjoy, which is saying a lot because if one thing hasn't changed from then, it's that American children still hate their greens. It didn't always used to be like that, you know? A lot of you can testify, since I'm sure you guys grew up eating things like one-pot butternut squash soup and collard greens more often than the kids these days get to. Things like that were just so widely available, and the best part was we weren't used to them. For example, take squash, right? It's primarily something you get in the summer, so it's seasonal. Nowadays, you have everything available in marts and stores around the clock without any regard for whether they're in season or not. Technology has just meant that preservation has come that far, which might sound good, and don't get me wrong, it is pretty good. It also means that people don't really get a chance to miss the flavors that come with each season. They get used to it, and so they eventually end up forgetting or disregarding dishes like that. Rural areas would always have dishes like butternut squash soup and make use of the rich broth and simple spices that kept costs really manageable while still giving you an incredible flavor experience. These days, that same kind of pre-cut squash will net you around $8 to $10 for a large batch, which is what you need for a big one-pot meal. That's a bit insane of a price jump, isn't it? People back then would kind of cope with not having things like squash when they were out of season by taking to canned food instead. Things like canned tuna were used to make tuna melts, which meant that a lot of people could enjoy a dish that needed basic toppings and sides to shine. It also meant you could really save your money. This same tuna melt would cost you around $5 to make at home these days, but it used to be infinitely less pricey. Don't you think your taxpayer money should mean you get a tuna melt for under $1? Sounds like a corny political slogan, but it's also kind of true. A lot of the reason you did get tuna for so cheap back then was because of rationing efforts, though. People, especially soldiers, really needed a cheap source of protein that didn't break the bank when you bought it in bulk. That's exactly why things like tuna melts were so popular in the first place. And by the 1960s and 1970s, it was a standard diner dish that you could get for just the right price. While we'll never go back to these 20th century prices, we could still be getting the same affordable locally sourced food for a lot less too. Your food could be acquired locally or inspired locally, and both would work. One of the best examples of that was when we decided to appreciate the flavors and tastes of our Mexican-American neighbors more and started incorporating hit dishes from their households like tamale pies. These were the best way to get some ground beef in your diet, and in general, they were an incredible source of protein. Not only was the beef good for that, they also had a healthy serving of beans. After that, all you needed was some cornmeal, and you were honestly done. Southwestern and Mexican-American communities thrived off of food like this, which not only fed entire families but made sure they wouldn't even think about food for the next 6 business hours. Today, this same pie might cost you around $10 to $15 to make at home. It's kind of funny and sadly ironic that dishes that were put into the mainstream during the Depression specifically because they were so convenient money-wise for people are now also absolutely out of our reach. During the Depression is when a lot of these ideas even first started circulating in the heads of the general American public. Before that, we were honestly not looking past classics like stuffed shells, which were also kind of a hybrid between local practices and something we took from Italian Americans. The Italian part came from how they used pasta and ricotta cheese to make the shells really stand out so much more, but again, it would cost you the same to make this today that it would to make a tamale pie. And my friend, I think that's a disservice to you. And me, and your kids, and anyone else's kids, you get the point. Where's a meat lover to go in this day and age? You can't even have stuffed shells anymore without worrying about what it'll cost you. Comparatively, when home-cooked food costs more or less the same as eating out, people lose a lot of incentive to start eating healthier. One of the best reasons health was so much better back then was because it was very easy for people to start eating better when they saw how much they were saving. I mean, that pizza is going to look a lot less preferable to that lasagna soup when you start doing the math yourself, right? I mean, cost-benefit analysis alone would have you abandoning all of that greasy, oily fast food, but let's not get too hasty. No such thing as a happy life without your weekend pizza. However, getting to the weekend is something that's pretty tiring as an adult, especially now that grind culture has become the norm. It's why we could do with dishes like lasagna soup coming back and having a resurgence, becoming a household staple once again. All it took was some lasagna noodles, cheese, ground beef, and basic herbs, and you were set to go. The ground meats were inexpensive, and it was an absolutely lovely soup, completely a polar opposite to things like the vegetable soup with gremolata, which is still kind of iffy flavor-wise if you stack it up to something like this, though on its own it's definitely a much tastier way to get greens in. Hey, you can even mix the two and eat like a king. Or at least you were able to, back when getting the ingredients. All that was still reasonable on a middle-class salary. A lot of the ideas around a fair day's pay for a fair day's work were exaggerated even back then. But thankfully, a lot of cuisine was built around the prices of ingredients and how easy it was to get things and sustain a certain kind of cooking on a daily or weekly basis. Tex-Mex dishes that were really popular in Mexican-American communities like migas with chorizo were really good at keeping budgets low and bellies full. Chorizo itself was a really affordable meat, and it is still pretty reasonable if you go out into markets today looking to recreate this dish. The eggs and tortillas were nothing to really worry about either, and it was something that people could easily enjoy and make while not having to worry. You know, even therapists say that if you're worrying or feeling anxiety while you're resting, it's not really real rest. That's why being able to kick back and enjoy a plate with both an empty stomach and an empty head makes it that much better. You actually get to, get your stamina back that way, but hey, everybody has to make do, right? And make do is exactly what people did with even their street food back then. It wasn't really too drastically different from what it is now. I mean, you can still get a bagel pizza around any city block and have it cost around $2 to $3, but back then, it cost you maybe $0.25, maximum. In the 1970s, bagels began taking on a new role as a base for pizza toppings, sparking the creation of bagel pizzas. This experimentative decade in American history gave rise to countless culinary innovations, with the bagel pizza being one of the many convenient and affordable food options to emerge. This trend tapped into the need for quick, inexpensive meals people could grab on their way to work, ideal for those who didn't have the time or money to dine at restaurants. Bagel pizzas offered a fresh, satisfying, and efficient solution that allowed people to enjoy the flavors of pizza on a smaller scale, giving a casual twist to a classic favorite. The bagels and toppings in those days were notably fresher, adding to the appeal of these mini pizza creations. Decades later, bagel pizzas remain a beloved snack, rooted in the 1970s culture of on-the-go convenience and experimentation. You really needed stuff like that. Convenient food you could buy off the street that tasted good and was cheap. One of the easiest ways to get fed and get fed well was ground chicken tacos. They weren't as common in the 20th century as they are nowadays, but when they were available back then, they were a lot cheaper. It's because they always relied on tortillas and seasonings, toppings like lettuce and cheese, and a lot more affordable ingredients, which meant that you could enjoy a decent taco for barely anything. Ground chicken is still a lot more expensive than it used to be back then. Tacos made with ground chicken nowadays cost around $8 to $10, but back then, they cost you less than $1. It was an alternative to beef tacos too. I mean, nowadays it's almost standard practice for people to get their food on the way or at work. Nobody bothers with lunch bags and stuff like that anymore. We could definitely use an affordable taco stand. That commute is already killing my paycheck. Alright, you might be wondering if a lot of the stuff we're used to seeing in food stalls these days wasn't as standard as it used to be, then what were people having when they did need quick food? They were having dishes that were easy to prepare in advance and cook up in minutes, like sesame chicken meatballs. Though even this is now more common than it used to be. It also took advantage of ground chicken instead of ground meat. People did use pork wherever they could, but most families would keep their pork reserved for special occasions and holidays when they really needed something good and flavorful to take the edge off. These were made using sesame oil, soy sauce, sugar, and Asian-based sauces, and were really flavorful little meatballs. Plus, if you made enough of them, it would definitely double as a main dish, and not just something you were using as a side or a snack to make sure you weren't starting your day completely hungry. Plus, a lot of the stuff that people used in food like this was really just pantry staples that most homes already had laying around. One of the best parts of cooking was seeing all the wonderful things you could do with grains. Any kind of grain, really, but especially rice. People would gorge themselves silly on fried rice back in the day and have it with basic sources of protein like a quick gravy and chicken, cubes of pork or beef, or if none of that was available, then honestly just eggs. Soy sauce and the different kinds of flavorings that people used in this dish were also really affordable and common. People had stocks of them and could use ample amounts without worrying. This is one recipe in particular that grandmas and home chefs favored, as it was seen as one of those go-to comfort foods. You know how if I say whiskey, the first thing that'll pop into your head is Jack Daniels. That's how it was for fried rice. You mention homely comfort food that'll have you feeling warm. Somebody would bring up fried rice. If you had meat to spare and could top it off with some, then that was even better. That trend is still something that hasn't changed too much, even if everything has gotten more expensive. A good rice bowl or any rice-based dish is still food for the soul. Caprese pasta salad is one of those things we took from our Italian-American friends, and it comes from the island of Capri in their home country. This dish is beautiful because it takes your everyday pantry staples and really makes something texturally and visually impressive, while also being very light on the budget. All you need for a caprese pasta are tomatoes, mozzarella, and basil, which, if you'll notice, also correspond to the colors of the Italian flag, being red, white, and green. This is a peak summer dish because that's when you get the freshest harvests for all of these. In terms of when we started adopting this from our Italian-American neighbors, well, that would be around the post-World War II era in America. People were just not in a position to get flavor the way they were used to. Let me explain. You ask an American their idea of what it means to make a flavorful dish, and they'll give you something worth trying, sure, but it'll be too expensive for a reasonable lunch or dinner. Italians, on the other hand, had pretty much mastered the art of accomplishing this in a cost-effective way. If you're either looking for flavor on a budget or just trying to incorporate a killer salad into your diet, this is easily the way to go. The pasta itself just added some volume to the dish, and the cheese sealed it all in, making it an accessible tour into Italian taste palates for a lot of people because it had the familiar aspect of pizza cheeses in it as well. It didn't need heavy dressings or sauces, and it could be made in batches. You could serve it cold, and you could take it along with you to a potluck really easily. All key traits of a dish that's broken into the mainstream and made a place for itself to stay. Speaking of things that could be taken easily, you had broccoli steaks. I know that's a pretty weird dish to think about, and easily transportable isn't exactly the best sales pitch for something that's looking to be a substitute for meat steaks, but hear me out here. They really rose to stardom around the early 2000s. This happened because finally, American families were concerned about the recent effects of all this fast food that was clogging up the country and the diets of their kids. I mean, you had ice cream parlors, soda fountains, McDonald's, and so much else all at your fingertips like never before. The average person's idea of getting good food from outside meant something like hash browns and bacon at a diner, not a quarter pounder with a large Coke. That's kind of why people started the whole trend of elevating vegetables to be the star of the show, so that it would hopefully inspire people to actually eat better by giving them healthier and greener alternatives to their typical favorites. You had stuff that resembled this before the 2000s too. Just look at cauliflower steaks. Nowadays, broccoli per pound costs around $2 to $3, but if you go for premium cuts like organic broccoli, you can expect that price to go up substantially. Back then, it was just a few cents per pound, and a lot of people were looking to take advantage of those prices and what they could do for their financial situation. Take a look at how much you spend per month on food every now and then, and you'll start to see where they were coming from. Chicken marsala is another example of how the Italians are always either saving our Saturday dinner plans or our wallets. And in this case, it's both. It features these really tender chicken cutlets, mushrooms, and if you're really feeling European, then some butter or cream. I'm just kidding, the butter and cream help make the consistency a lot thicker, so definitely try it out with that if you ever get to making this. Marsala gets its name from its most valuable player, which is the Marsala wine. This is an Italian fortified wine that comes from Sicily and is the reason behind the unique flavor of the sauce and that lovely sweetness. When the first or second waves of Italian immigrants first started to come over to America and spread their roots, a lot of their traditional recipes got adapted into the culture of the United States as well. While this dish is typically made with veal back home, For Americans, especially during the times when these immigrants were first coming along, chicken was wildly more affordable. It let people get a taste of a home-cooked meal that could stand up to even the finest restaurants available if you were following a good recipe. And since there was a big focus on community and just going on over to your neighbors and asking them what they're making, it wasn't the hardest thing in the world to get a good recipe. You might be wondering how this was affordable since Marsala wine is an obviously imported premium product, right? Well, the trick was that you only needed the sparsest amounts of it to get the sauce going. You didn't really need to pour in a glass or a full shot, just a few dashes here and there. The overall cost was, as a result, pretty manageable. But now, it would definitely be something that you'd consider mid to high range for one dinner. A lot of the food that people popularly consumed was honestly mid-range food. It made use of the things we've gone over so far on this list and mixed it with styles of food that people were already really comfortable with, like veggie and bean burritos. That was a really budget-friendly option that only got more and more popular as Tex-Mex cuisine started spreading throughout America. Mexican burritos were some of the best ways to have flavor on a tight budget and still feel full as well. Plus, when the cuisine started making rounds in the big places like California and Texas, that only spread the word of mouth around it even farther and farther. It was a customizable, plant-based alternative to meat burritos, and thanks to the health-conscious and vegan movements that were starting to pick up steam around the end of the 20th century, food like this only got propelled higher. Nowadays, you wouldn't really find the same love for it, but if you've ever spent a dinner with a Mexican family or been invited to their potlucks, you know how it goes. It was one of the most economic and sustainable meals you could possibly make for yourself, which is exactly what I'm here to show you today. We're going to end this list with just one more Italian dish. It's kind of poetic that we started with bean soup and are ending with tortellini soup, isn't it? So far, we've seen so many different ideas at play and how they manage to actually work. It's American creativity and resourcefulness at its best, but it also shows just how much the people who have come to America from different corners of the world have left an impact on the culture and cuisine of this nation. Tortellini soup itself was always a well-known meal back in its home country, but here it really needed to make a name for itself. Luckily, when you bring honest value to the table with no gimmicks all wrapped in a neat little bow that we affectionately refer to as affordable pricing, it's hard for the competition to keep up, especially when the competition keeps sending you to the doctors for gut health problems and heartburn issues. Tortellini soup was made with some pasta, cheese, and meat in a tomato-based soup, all of which were easily available back then. The thing is, it didn't take a lot of any of this except the pasta. Even that was only something you'd get if you were stretching it to serve a family of 6 or 7, but if you were just making a warm bowl of soup for 2 people, then you wouldn't need a lot at all. It was a comfort soup. And whenever people wanted homely meals on a budget, they'd often look to Italian cooking anyway. I mean, if ratatouille taught us anything, it's that Italian Americans, especially the grandmas, really know how to get the best of whatever they find in a cabinet. Maybe that's a trait shared by grandmas in general, though, but regardless, it's people like that we have to thank for providing us with some of the best meals we can have on a budget without feeling like we're settling for subpar food. Ah, crêpes Suzette. Yeah, these were just as fancy as they sound. This elegant dish was like the fancy cousin who always steals the show at family gatherings. Thin, delicate crepes drenched in a buttery orange sauce, then flambéed tableside. What's not to savor? From its name alone, you'd guess crêpes Suzette is a French delicacy, but this finger food quickly made its way to parties around the globe. Crêpes Suzette was the ultimate in sophistication and pizzazz, often making an appearance at upscale restaurants or special celebrations. The flambé technique, where the sauce was set on fire, really set this one apart from all other finger foods on the table. However, this decadent dessert has fallen out of favor, possibly because of the decline in tableside flambé performances. But let's not forget the joy of watching a waiter set your dessert on fire. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Next, let's talk about cheese straws. No, not the ones you sip your drink with. Cheese straws were a traditional food of England and the southern United States. These baked strips of cheesy dough were a party favorite. Made from a simple mixture of flour, butter, and cheddar cheese, they were twisted into straw-like shapes and baked to perfection. The result? A crunchy, savory snack that pairs perfectly with a cocktail or a glass of wine. And don't get me started on how easy they were to just grab and go. Cheese straws perfectly combined simplicity with sophistication and were ideal for any get-together, from casual parties to more upscale gatherings. Well, all good things come to an end, and sadly, cheese fingers were abandoned after living their days out in the 70s. Cheese-stuffed celery will definitely raise your eyebrow because at least the rest have some logic to them, but celery? Frankly speaking, the dish was not received positively in its very earliest days. Crazy ideas like vegetables and cheese definitely had to grow on people, but slowly and steadily, it did make an impression. Economic perils would make their minds more open to it, though, because it saw a spike in popularity following the stock market fiasco. People were aware that, on its own, this did not exactly make anyone's stomach hungry. Bacon and tomatoes or fried onions were usual for this dish, and it definitely worked better with them. Mimicked the taste of a burger in some way for a few people, but it is not hard to see why this dish faded away from family tables when times were better. Who says sandwiches can't be fancy? Enter the mini tomato sandwiches with bacon mayonnaise. Bacon mayonnaise, I know you're all ears. Keep listening. These tiny bite-sized sandwiches featured ripe heirloom tomatoes nestled between slices of soft bread, with a delicious spread of bacon-flavored mayonnaise. The combination of juicy tomatoes and smoky bacon spread was a flavor explosion that captured the essence of summer in the 70s. Summer in the 70s was all about pool parties and finger-licking appetizers that were not only easy to enjoy, but also made every splash and sunny moment even more delicious. These mini sandwiches were also often served at garden parties and brunches, where their refreshing taste and elegant presentation made them a hit. Over time, they've been replaced by more elaborate canapes. If you're a tomato lover, these little sandwiches are a must-try. Cheese canapes continue the trend of this list's cheese-based starters, as it is another appetizer that was elevated for the middle-class American taste buds via cheese. In fact, they were pretty popular at fancy upper-class parties because the cheese biscuits were perfect to munch on mid-conversation. Cheese canapes would be made up of open-faced biscuits with garlic herbs and cheddar cheese or cream cheese. Taste-wise, it resembled a little explosion of cheese in your mouth with just the perfect amount of crunch, similar to nachos. Even fancier variants of the dish would involve smoked salmon or onion jam served alongside with it. When used in combination with other foods like that, it stood out but not long enough to stay in recent memory. Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. So this is a bit of a tricky name to pronounce even when you give it a genuine try, but it's worth knowing about this dish because of how good it is. Next on the table, we have garlic knots. The 1970s were all about extravagant dinner parties and quirky appetizers. This was the era when finger foods became a must-have at gatherings, and hosts loved getting creative with their presentations. That's when this delicious treat came to life. These tasty little morsels were a staple at pizzerias and Italian restaurants, often served as a starter or side dish. Made from pizza dough tied into a knot, these bites were generously coated in garlic butter and sprinkled with herbs. The result? A soft, pillowy delight with a burst of garlicky flavor. Garlic knots were perfect for dipping in marinara sauce, making them a versatile and addictive snack. The only downside? Once you started eating, it was so easy to lose count and keep going, as each bite was just too irresistible to stop at just one. While they haven't completely disappeared, they've become less common as more trendy appetizers have taken the spotlight. Cheese enchiladas would be tossed, fried, and baked with everything from red sauces to cheddar cheese and mushrooms. Every ingredient typically associated with pizza has found its way into some cheese enchilada recipes. Iowa particularly loves the flavor bomb that this dish is because it has spice, it has gooey sweet cheese, and it has the perfect amount of flavor from seasonings. Of course, it was going to be a mainstay in many places besides just Iowa. Most of the items on the list so far are similar to appetizers or snacks, however, this was its own meal. Best part about it is that it worked with any kind of cheese store-bought or farm-grown. In fact, experimenting with cheeses added variety to a beloved dish in the 50s. Sad to see it go as just another cheesy dish from the last century. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, Whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Now, butter-baked saltine crackers are the ultimate example of how a few simple ingredients can turn into an irresistible snack. This simple snack became a hit during the 1970s due to its incredibly easy preparation and delightful taste. The process involves baking plain saltine crackers with a layer of melted butter and seasoning, which transforms them into a crispy, flavorful treat. The result is a snack that's both savory and satisfying, perfect for munching straight from the tray or serving at a party. The beauty of butter-baked saltines lies in their simplicity. They're incredibly easy to make. Just brush the crackers with butter and bake them until crispy. They're a nostalgic favorite from the 70s, offering a no-fuss, flavorful treat that pairs perfectly with a variety of dips or just on their own. Here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. In the 70s, dips were the star of the show, and hot cheesy crab dip was no exception. It was a total crowd pleaser that everyone raved about. Think of a warm, gooey blend of cream cheese, crab meat, and a medley of spices, all melted together into a dip that was pure heaven. Served with crackers or slices of crusty bread, this dip was a must-have at 1970s parties, especially near coastal areas where fresh crab was abundant. The combination of tender crab meat and rich cheese made it an irresistible treat that kept partygoers coming back for more. Now, it's rare to find this dip at modern gatherings, but it remains a delicious reminder of the luxurious flavors of the past. So, if you ever get the chance, give this retro dip a whirl. You won't regret it. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings. So depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Remember stuffed celery sticks? These crunchy, refreshing snacks were a hit at cocktail parties and gatherings. The concept was simple: celery sticks filled with a creamy mixture of cheese, peanut butter, or even pimento spread. Sometimes they were topped with chopped nuts or olives for an extra punch of flavor. These sticks were not only delicious, but also offered a satisfying crunch, making them a great contrast to other softer finger foods. Today, they've largely been replaced by more elaborate appetizers, but stuffed celery sticks still hold a special place in the hearts of those who grew up snacking on them. Plus, they were a sneaky way to get some veggies into your diet. It's a win-win when appetizers are not only finger-licking good, but also healthy. What more can you ask for? Okay, so the beloved party pies. These mini savory pies were a staple at 1970s gatherings, offering a variety of fillings like minced meat, chicken, or even vegetables. Encased in a buttery, flaky crust, party pies were the perfect handheld snack, easy to eat while mingling. This variant of the standard meat pie is considered iconic. It was described by New South Wales Premier Bob Carr in 2003 as Australia's national dish. New Zealanders regard the meat pie as a part of New Zealand cuisine, and it forms part of the New Zealand national identity. They were often served hot, straight from the oven, making them an irresistible treat. Whether you preferred a classic beef pie or a creamy chicken and mushroom, there was a party pie to suit every taste. Today, they've been somewhat overshadowed by other finger foods, but their deliciousness and versatility make them a nostalgic favorite. So, why not whip up a batch and bring a bit of 1970s flair to your next gathering? Don't we all love a sunny side up? Well, try pairing it with jam because it will surely bring back some post-Cold War nostalgia. Now, you were probably not even born when fried eggs with jam were all the rage, but your grandparents must have memories of this meal. Eggs were one of the first foodstuffs to disappear at the beginning of the Second World War. But the Soviet authorities were quick to find a solution in the powdered eggs provided by the US under the 1942 Lend-Lease program. Yeah, you heard that right. Powdered eggs. As you can imagine, people had all sorts of reactions to powdered eggs initially because what kind of world didn't have something as basic as eggs to offer? But soon everyone realized that the world wasn't doomed, and powdered eggs were a blessing in disguise. We'll talk more about them later in the video because, believe it or not, they were a whole meal on their own. The jam was usually homemade, whipped in the autumn after the ripe berries and fruit had been picked at holiday homes and farms. It's the kind of food combo where you throw together two random pantry items and end up with a masterpiece. Cheese sandwich loaf is exactly what it sounds like, with a lovely helping of cream cheese to add to the experience. Cheese lovers watching right now must have been wondering when a sandwich would make its debut. Let's just say we saved the best for last, and that is not an exaggeration because this sandwich was downright heavenly. Arguably the king of the pile, and that is one extremely competitive title to claim, versions of this sandwich would still influence loaves and other sandwiches in recent history. One for every kind of festivity you can think of or on boring Saturday nights. Cheddar cheese was a very popular pick, but people went with many, and it gave each state its own flavor profile. Nowadays, it is hard to find the exact version of this you would see back in those days because it changed heavily later. Cheese tarts are another entry in the dessert section for this list. Cherries, cherry custard, or jam would even be popular toppings for these. Japanese-American restaurants featured their own variants called Hokkaido cheese tarts. French-American restaurants, on the other hand, took to making this a staple for dessert menus. Meanwhile, the South would be cooking up its own cheesy storm. Graham cracker crumbs would also be used to add a crunch factor to the dish. As you can tell, it found a lot of love and experimentation alike. Far and wide, these were very adored entrees, munchies, or hors d'oeuvres for any decent dinner or party. Nowadays, you would not find them in the menu for events because palates have changed widely. The 1930s to 1980s were times of great change in America, but their love for cheese is pretty loud and clear. Moving on, we have ham delights. This one tastes even better than it looks. These bite-sized sandwiches were a 1970s party staple made with soft rolls, ham, Swiss cheese, and a flavorful poppy seed butter glaze. The rolls were typically brushed with the butter mixture and baked until the cheese melted, creating a gooey, savory treat. The combination of the sweet rolls, salty ham, and tangy cheese was a match made in heaven. Now, it wasn't the healthiest snack on the table, but trust me, resisting this bad boy wasn't an option. Ham delights were often served warm, making them a comforting and satisfying snack. With the advent of pre-sliced deli meats and ready-made rolls, ham delights offered a quick and easy way to serve guests something tasty without spending hours in the kitchen. They've somewhat faded from the party scene, but their delicious simplicity is timeless. So, if you're looking for an easy and tasty appetizer, ham delights are a great choice. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Spinach artichoke dip is a beloved classic that has been a staple at parties and gatherings for decades. Its popularity skyrocketed in the 1970s, thanks in part to its introduction at chain restaurants like the Olive Garden. While it has roots in classic American cuisine, the dip's creamy and flavorful combination of spinach and artichokes made it a hit as a restaurant appetizer around the globe. This warm, creamy dip combines spinach, artichokes, and cheese into a comforting blend that's both rich and flavorful. It can be served with an array of dippers, from crunchy tortilla chips and pita bread to fresh vegetable sticks and crusty bread slices. It's easy to make, yet always feels like a treat. Whether you're hosting a casual get-together or a more formal gathering, spinach artichoke dip brings a touch of retro elegance and comfort to the table. Vinaigrette was a traditional Cold War-era salad. So the Russians weren't just leading the space race by sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit, they were also 2 steps ahead with their delicious meals. But if you really want to get into the history of this classic, it's the French who really deserve the credit. At the end of the 18th century, when French chefs began arriving in Russia, few could find apprentices who understood them well. These peasants introduced a great deal of confusion and inaccuracy into their masters' recipes, and as a result, vinaigrette was born. While the name originates from the French dressing vinaigrette, in Russia it was attached to the dish that used it as a dressing. During the Cold War, this dish was simplified further. The meat was all but eliminated, leaving only sauerkraut, beets, and pickles, and the intricate French dressing was replaced with sunflower oil. But don't let its simple ingredients fool you. It still tasted like a culinary masterpiece. No Cold War pantry was complete without a can of beans and a pack of hot dogs, the classic combo. Before burgers and fries claimed their spot as the ultimate food pairing, hot dogs and beans were the unbeatable duo that ruled the meal scene. Baked beans were among the first canned convenience foods to emerge in the United States, dating back to the Civil War. This meal was all anyone could ask for during the tough days of the war. Easy to prepare, packed with protein, and finger-licking good. What's not to love? Yeah, this one was really a lifesaver for the lazy ones. Canned beans and hot dogs were perfect for a quick filling meal that didn't require much effort. You could heat it up on a stove or eat it straight from the can if you were really in a pinch. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Now, next up is smoked fish dip. Smoked fish, like mullet, was a staple in Florida's coastal communities due to the abundance of fish and the preservation methods available. Smoked fish dip evolved as a way to enjoy this preserved fish in a creamy, flavorful dip, making it a popular choice at southern gatherings and seafood festivals. This smoky dip was a popular appetizer at parties, especially in coastal regions. Made with smoked fish, cream cheese, and a blend of herbs and spices, it offered a rich and flavorful experience. The dip was usually served with crackers, bread, or vegetable sticks, making it a versatile addition to any spread. The smoky flavor of the fish paired perfectly with the creamy base, creating a dip that was both indulgent and satisfying. While smoked fish dip is still enjoyed in some circles, it's not as common as it once was. However, it remains a delicious throwback to the flavors of the past. Basic pimiento cheese, the southern classic that made its way into the hearts of many during the 70s. This creamy cheese spread was made with shredded cheddar cheese, mayonnaise, and pimientos, giving it a rich, tangy flavor. It was often served as a dip with crackers, spread on sandwiches, or even used as a filling for celery sticks. Basic pimiento cheese has a charming southern origin, with its roots tracing back to the early 20th century in the United States. The spread became popular as a versatile and inexpensive appetizer or sandwich filling, reflecting the southern tradition of making the most out of simple ingredients. Its name comes from pimiento, a type of sweet pepper that adds a distinctive flavor and vibrant color to the cheese. Today, pimiento cheese is still enjoyed, but it's not as ubiquitous as it once was. However, its creamy, cheesy goodness remains a nostalgic favorite for many. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else, but Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Cheese-stuffed peppers flipped the script from ideas like pimento cheese specials, which had peppers involved but not like this. Peppers would be loaded with a cheese filling in this case and baked to make for an entirely new culinary experience. Part of the era of experimentative cooking in a craze to grasp the next new trend. People would use anything from bell peppers to sweet ones or yellow peppers. Definitely a dish that saw heavy change in a short time frame, however. While it got points for creativity, it did not last. Stuffed peppers were not exactly too new of an idea in the States, but no one had thought to use cheese fillings. Maybe they should make a comeback? Or maybe we take the lesson that stuffed food can be good like stuffed crusts and be glad people moved on. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. How did you like our roundup of all the cheap meals previous generations made? Comment your favorites down below and don't forget to like and subscribe.